All right. Thank you for having me here. I give a bit of a background of me. It's a bunch of different things over the years. I've actually spent a lot of time here in Phoenix and in Scottsdale, actually, working with a number of clients. I live in Southern California, Redondo Beach, to be exact, so I don't get to see a lot of lightning, rainstorms, and yesterday's monsoon was awesome. Glad I got in early for that. But my career over the past 20-something years, I've lost count. As you get older, you just do that, I guess. Let me turn off my notifications here too and kill Slack. Oh, notifications are off, but Slack doesn't want to pay attention to that. So we kill Slack. But I've been doing software development as long as I can remember, and a lot longer than that. I started as actually way back in the day, I was an assembly programmer, 6800, 6809, I'm getting really old school on that. Old color computer, building stuff, built my first CAD on an Apple IIc while I was in junior high. I guess I'm dating myself. But got into, in the commercial world, got into Power Builder as a developer. And I actually was building systems up in Canada. You'll hear the out and about once in a while. I haven't lost those things. They've been living in the States for, 24 years now, I think. But some things I just can't shake. So the out and about will always come out. But I actually moved with PowerSoft. I worked for them, moved to the States, like I said, about 24 years ago. And seen a lot of companies over the years. One of the things that I did is I spun off with a company called Silverstream, which came out of the PowerSoft guys. And we started to build Java applications way back in the day. And I followed Java through quite a bit through the years. And fast forwarding, through a number of different things, but, did some time at SAP, which actually was PowerSoft was bought by Sybase, which was eventually bought by SAP. So I wound up getting in there and doing some more time in there. Got into the startup world. Loved doing startups. Helped a bunch of startups as customers and actually part-time CTO of a couple of them at one time, building development teams, trying to figure out, who am I going to work with, where, all around the world, how do we get quality software put out there? So this stuff is close to home for me. And the worst part was, it's about 2 years ago, due to software quality issues, everything came across my desk. One night I was working, trying to just catch up on some things, realized my developers were failing me. And it really sucked because it was a 36-hour workday, nonstop, followed by shingles. Don't do that. Don't do those days. Trust me, it really takes a toll on the body. But it really got me paying attention more to processes and what we can do. And this, again, has just touched me really close. So, I want to go through and talk about what is continuous reliability. What are the challenges for delivering these quality applications and, the path to continuous reliability? How can we get there? And like I said, for those that are just joining me, I'm Chris Voisey from OverOps. I want to make this interactive. I want you guys to maybe share some stuff, and I'll try to repeat it for those that are listening in or online later on. But this is really something for you guys to share with each other, right? That's what I believe these user groups are all about in these meetups. Because I can talk to you, I can tell you stuff. I'm coming from a vendor. Let's call it out like it is, right? So I'm seeing certain things. So I want to have you guys sharing your experiences and validating some of the stuff I'm seeing up here as well. So the first thing is, what is continuous reliability? Reliability being the key start of this. It's I could read it, I guess. Probability of a piece of software operating without failure in a specific environment over a set duration of time. Fun scientific answer, great. Okay, but software operating without failure. Does anybody have environments like that? No, yeah. We want to keep getting there, yeah. Stephen, you were going to say?
Depends on how you define failure.
It depends how you define failure, right? And that's one of the questions, right? And we'll get into that a little more because, failure can be, it's amazing how many things get into deployment these days. And there's actually known errors and there's known things that you have in there. But it's more important to get into the environment. Failure could just be, hey, the customer was ultimately able to finish their experience, buy a product, onboard something. Failures could be happening in the background and you've just got to clean them up and do stuff as you go along. And that's kind of where we get into this continuous reliability, because you're always trying to improve it. And it's a balance between speed, quality, and complexity that you have to start to go and look. And really that utopia of all these in the middle, I've yet to ever see. Usually people are like trying to push the builds out there fast. Like what are the build cycles that you guys have? How many are deploying new builds every week? Every other week? Twice or 3 times a day. Twice or 3 times a day. Okay, how many are doing that often? Within a day, multiple deploys. Okay, the agile environments are really strong now, right? And that's what people are pushing. So how many are doing more? I'm curious to see longer term. How many is more than, every week or every other week? You guys, okay? Compliance issues and stuff like that sometimes? Yeah, so longer environments are sometimes because of compliance. I work with Caesars is one of my customers I deal with a lot. Talk about compliance. They have their e-banking application that we're running under and monitoring. Everything in that environment has to go through the Gaming Commission. I want to know if they really look at every line of code and stuff like that. I'm kind of curious. But the reality is that they're planning and they can only do deployments maybe a couple of times a year because of that. And then how many often were you doing? You said it was longer? To production, yeah. Monthly? Yeah, so we've got everything to from multiple times a day to monthly to every few months in some cases. The complexity of the applications, they're constantly growing in complexity. We start to get into microservices. Starting to break these things up. They're supposed to be less complex, but it makes them more because you keep piling on more microservices to do more different things and more disparate services that are sitting all around. So how do you start to look at the quality of those and know that every time you add another microservice, it's talking to the other microservice, it's talking to another one, that's going to continue to work throughout that chain. It just keeps expanding on. So we have to start to look at this and figure out where it is. Well, the continuous reliability itself is the notion of balancing all these things together and figuring out where your balance is on the Venn diagram here. Say, you're probably going to be weighed in some corner of this. You're not always going to bring these closer, and you're trying to get to that utopia, but I think it's one of those things that we'll all agree just doesn't necessarily ever get there. So the complexity they keep getting more complex. The quality, you're trying to get better with every release, and like the different things, and we'll talk a little bit about this as we go along, like manual code reviews, automated code reviews, different types of security scans that are going through them at all the times, and then kicking back, and how do we handle those loops? So really you're trying to do data-driven quality gates and feedback loops. It's those loops that you have to keep going and saying, hey, do we pass or reject the builds that are going through? How many people have completely automated software development life cycles that once you throw the code up there, it starts to run its first sets of tests and then automatically goes into production? So all the tests are going through, no manual, and that's where we want to go, right? And this is kind of what I'm seeing with customers. Like, again, one group, I'll just use Caesars as another example because it's interesting. One guy that we're working with there, that's exactly what he's doing. Of all the different groups I work with, only one. So you're kind of a perfect demographic and showing in your one person in the entire room is doing that, nobody else is. So we'll talk a little bit about that and the challenges that get into how to get there. How many use the tried old faithful, I don't truly test things till they're in production? You can admit it. I'm not going to hold you accountable. We're not going to write down here. All right, so we got one at least. I can't tell you how many of my customers that I actually go in And I will actually be nice and not name names of the customers, but there's security products, there are end user products, there's things that are going through. Luckily, the banking customers I work with, like Wells Fargo is a good example of a bank I've done a lot of work with over the years. Their testing cycles are incredible. Like they're going through everything for good reason. Compliance industries again, right? But you know, I have these customers that they don't test their code until it goes into production, or they don't do an exhaustive set of tests. How do you come up with your tests that you're running through? So if you're doing, forget the customer-based ones where you're getting the call into support, how do you guys build your tests?
So we try to build them to not only adhere to what the customer experience should be, but also trying to take the non-customer perspective and try to break it.
Mm-hmm.
And then we do that through a series of tests.
And you keep building on those over time, I bet.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the goal, is you keep adding to them. How many people kind of subscribe more to that test-driven development methodology, where you're setting up kind of no strict adherence to that? I hear the concept out there a lot. I hear a lot of people trying to do test-driven development, but the reality is that there's just not enough. You're going through, you set your Jira task up, and you have a bunch of tests that are sitting in there, and theoretically, the developer has gone through a bunch of those right there. Right, so I bet some of you are doing that. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, and actually that goes back to my shingles story. That's what exactly failed. We had our customer setting up all these tests, but they were the ones I'm stuck on something here. Here we go. They're the ones that were in this set of boundaries right here. The customers, the dumb customers or challenging ones, well, there's no boundary, right? You have no idea what can happen. This was doing some IoT work I was doing. As soon as you just like, hey, I wonder what happened if I just turned this off right now and stopped the process. You know, it was an IoT device. What happens if it goes off and then they flick it back on because they were impatient for 30 seconds? Boom, failed. You can't send that out. So we start to have to do all these things and anticipate. But you got to learn by what the customers are doing too, and having test audiences, like throwing beta groups out there and having that. But again, the goal is to bring this all back and automate it. And that's where you're going to see the theme of a lot of the stuff I'm talking about is how do we find ways to, you know, to get to like what Steven's doing and automate these. So what are the challenges that we really face? This is always a fun one, and it goes across the board everywhere I go. The technical debt. What I'm referring to here is applications, maybe monolith applications, they've been written over the past 10, 15 years. How many have applications and pieces of your application that have been sitting around for 10 years or more? We'll just go with that. Nobody. So a lot of these are new ones. So I guess if you're doing Node and stuff like that, it's kind of a little harder. Could be. We're really on the edge there. But the reality is we get into those. Now, so you've got 10 years, maybe 5 years. How many are going back 5 years? Okay, got a couple more. How many are over a year? Okay, I'm going to guess everybody at this point. How many of those apps have your developers that have built that stuff moved on? Some of them. You have no idea how they did this, right? How they built this, what their logic was at the time. You have coding practices. You have things that you're trying to do. But how do you figure out, you know, how they were thinking and how to, you know, fix things that are broken in their code when you start introducing new features in the future? And that's something we constantly have to deal with. Third-party code. How many people are using third-party code? And don't bother answering this one. Everybody's probably using some third-party code of some form in their application today. That's how we code, right? It goes back to the old days of COBOL, really, in the copybook, and starting with something. Like, this has just evolved to make it easier to find pieces and integrate it in. And we're all going up to GitHub and different places and grabbing the code we want to build the functionality. Our product has pieces in it from that. You know, that's why we have Apache and MIT and all these other libraries that are out there. And of course, it's never our problem. We're always pointing the finger at, you know, Steven. He was, actually, no, you didn't do it. It's Sean. It's easy to point to the sales guy. You know, he did the code wrong. And you're, but yeah, when you get into a scenario, well, this is the fun part, right? When you really get down to it, when you start to look at, and let's go beyond the actual code itself, let's talk about the environment. You've got operations, you've got security, you've got the coder, the developers, you've got the people that, like, everybody in there. What if the memory was not allocated right? You know, it's always somebody else's problem, right? And trying to figure out, oh, did you allocate enough memory in this application run? Oh, well, then that was your problem. You should have doubled it. You know, garbage collection didn't kick in on time, and things like that. So there's constantly these finger pointing going on when it's a human interaction part of the way. But then you get these lists, the lists that never end. And how do you prioritize? How do you prioritize your issues that are in their software development right now? Sorry? Customer impact. Okay, there's a good way. First of all, you have to collect it all somewhere. Usually it's in like Jira, maybe ServiceNow, or spreadsheet. So you were going to add to effort estimate. Oh, more often than not, it's effort estimates, right? Exactly. You're trying to figure out how much effort is it going to be to actually fix that. And then sometimes some of the biggest stuff is the biggest effort. So it's going to be, okay, this will be over the next 6 months. We'll improve it. Maybe we'll do 20% of it now, or 30% of it in another month, and so on. But you have to have a way to prioritize when you get these lists. And they've got these lists, and they're sitting in Jira. And I always like, so as a developer, we like to have what our units of work laid out and figure out where they are, and maybe even break them down further. And that always leads up to the big Jira database, essentially, right? And there's just this long list, and business people hate Jira, I think. Every time I'd go in as a CTO and I'd go sit with the CEO or the business stakeholders, I'd go in, oh yeah, we'll just put it in Jira. And I'm like, oh geez, don't make me search through there because I don't understand what's in there, right? And it gets lost. So then there's, you know, the unknown error number. Like how many errors are really popping up? What are the unknowns in your application? And the errors that are happening you don't even know about. You know, and I'll talk about a couple examples of this. And lack of context. When something fails, what happened? What's the first thing you do when something fails in your production application? Because let's face it got to production, we didn't have a test case. How do you figure out what's shopping cart fails in an app? What would be maybe the first thing you start to look at? The logs. Yeah, who said that? Was it log right here? Okay, sorry. The little air conditioning is throwing off the dynamics exactly where, but the logs. Start to grep the logs. Try to figure out what's in there. And then what else do you have to start to figure out? What the user did, right? Or where the data is going. Did it break? Did we lose a database connection? Did we have a network issue that caused that? So we're grepping the logs and trying to go in there. So, you know, we have a lot of different legacy tools and processes that help us through these, you know, manual pure code reviews. It's funny how many people are still doing pure code reviews. Okay, a lot. Who can tell me probably one of the biggest issues of pure code reviews? Maybe not for you being the pure code doing the code review, maybe another colleague or somebody else. Lack of constructive feedback. That's actually a good one.
I think from our perspective too, like a lot of times it's really difficult to do like a true analysis of something, especially if it's a complex thing. Like you really have to do it. Like, look at the logic, doesn't make sense. You know, your point, giving the other feedback. A lot of times I think like what will happen is like you're working the test. Okay, that's it's approved, right?
Right.
You know, not I would say not actual problem.
Okay, let's get.
From our perspective, we were doing peer reviews and it was large code base, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you give a developer 10 lines of code to review, they'll find 10 things wrong. If you give them 500 lines of code to review, they won't find anything wrong.
Yep.
So
Overwhelming,
yeah.
right? And going back to something I was touching on earlier, sometimes there's a bit of a personal preference, and we're not necessarily going to agree on the same way we'd approach the problem, right? Software is not a definitive path that you take for everything. We all have different choices we'll make. Sometimes third-party plugins, sometimes just the algorithm that we built, and just different ways, or not, lack of understanding. The worst ones are also, and more, right? I see this, and I'm not going to pick on anywhere particular, but you're offshoring or sourcing out. Doesn't matter where. It could be even onshore somewhere. Laziness, right? Peer review. Oh yeah, we did. Check mark. We went through. Bob and Frank talked, and it's all good, and they reviewed the code. How long did they did it over beers, and they started at the 5th beer maybe, and they just never got through everything. So this is one of the problems that I see a lot of times that are out there, and it's not that it's a bad step, because I think it's good, because you have an internal feedback loop and you're working together as teams. But they can't be counted on is the reality, right? So then you have your QA team writing and running test cases, and the key thing is always keeping those test cases flowing and evolving constantly, and also dropping off sometimes. I see this more often than not, where you don't drop off ones that are no longer applicable. Sometimes you'll actually be searching. I've actually had a case where I searched for an error on a test case that I don't know why nobody thought about it, but it's not even a sequence that somebody's even going to do anymore, because the outcome of that is, it was a promotion that ended a year ago, and it no longer was applicable, but we just were looking for some, I'm trying to put it in context, because if I say too much, it gives a little too much of it away, but we were looking for something that just didn't matter, and we were basing it on the data that was involved, not the reality of thinking of what actually was happening and how it didn't apply. So always keeping those updated. Unit testing, developers writing unit tests, they always say they did them. They don't really always get to them. Like sometimes we don't follow the test case, so we think we're doing something that's described, or they're too finite, they're too granular and not open enough to go in there and do it. And then we're doing manual deployments, waiting for QA region to become available. How many people actually are still waiting for a QA environment to pop up just so they can run tests? I'm guessing it still happens, but that's where we have to really start to look at that and have these things available all the time. And that now with AWS and having these environments fired up and just instantly, shutting down, firing up and shutting down has been great. And, oh God, manual build of deployment of applications, waste of time, right? And I spent so much time doing this. And how many people are still doing manual deployment of apps? Anybody want to admit it in a little bit? Sometimes you have to, right? Sometimes you've just got to build a one-off test or something like that. But it's just something that can really trip you up and if you're doing this over and over again, this does become a waste of time, and you're going to spend less time in handling that. So you got to start asking yourself, when do we start promoting the code? When do we start sending it out? We'll start talking about some of the solutions to a lot of this next year. But the head of QA gives a green light. Again, there's a human interaction there. There's somebody, maybe they don't have the full time to do it, and they just need it because it's a delivery date, and we need to get it out there. Query the APM or logs to see if there are less errors in the last build. I've actually seen this at customers where it's like, hell yeah, we had 1,000 errors in the previous build. We got it down to 750. We're ready to go. It's a real scenario, right? And that makes zero sense, because who knows what those are? Because you're not measuring it based on anything that has any valuable metric to it. I'm going to ask, because the next one, don't have a choice because management wants feature released. That's real, right? So we got to get to a point where we're actually making sure that doesn't necessarily play a factor. It's always going to be in there, but we got to get this quality faster and earlier so that it doesn't happen. How do we know if we've introduced new or resurfaced regressions, errors that we've fixed for things in the past? Do we really know that the tests have passed? Do we really, have we looked through everything we possibly could? And so then looking at, at the end of the day, starting to look at release over release. How do we know that our code is really improving? How do we know that we actually have less customer complaints, less 7.1 issues? Do we really know? We don't. Right? Some people are like, oh yeah, well, less calls into customer care. Well, I know it, depending on the companies, and I was working with Hoover. It was actually interesting. It was part of an IoT project I was working on, where customer service is a whole other group. Not even, these are end consumer products that are going out there. And it's amazing what happens when you go and you talk to them and find out what the issues they're hearing from customers and why the hell this feedback doesn't get back to me in development or running the development group. Because it's just simple, fundamental things that could actually be building new use cases, test cases that are in there to say, hey, let's start to look at these and start to listen to what the end consumers are saying about it. And we may only be looking at maybe the top 5 and it's what people are thinking about, but there's so much other feedback that's out there. So this is the path to continuous reliability, right? This is where we're starting to look, and we start to look at the CI/CD pipelines, and we have to have these feedback loops. And we have to have, automation is kind of one of the biggest things that I truly do believe in to start moving things. To start to like, what happens when you throw a build out there and it fails? Well, sometimes, okay, so what do you use for your CI/CD process? What tools are being used in here? Sorry?
Circle CI.
Circle CI, okay. Jenkins, really popular. So which one, sorry? Cloud build, okay. On Google, yep, on Google Cloud. Any others? TeamCity, Bamboo. There's a bunch of them out there. There's no excuse not to. Who's not using any CI/CD product today? This might be one that nobody wants to. It is, but I kid you not, I still go to customers that a lot of this stuff is still theory. And they're not doing, or they're doing again as a check mark, and really the importance of going in there. So you throw a script up and it goes and it runs your Selenium test, it runs all, a bunch of things that are in there. There are times that you have to actually make the choice. Hey, here's my report. Should I push it on? How many errors were legitimate in there? And in the product, so we actually have in our product, we integrate with all the different tools, and we have, as part of one of the metrics, to say, this is customer driven. We had to add this. What is the error threshold you want this to meet in order to pass it through? So certain errors are acceptable, and that is true, right? But are things like, do you start to weigh out things like null pointers? If null pointers are starting to pop in, index, arrays out of bounds. Are these breaking into your code? Are you checking for those to see if those are going through and running through your code at runtime? Like, these are reasons that you may want to start and say, okay, well, I could just flag it, but then I'm going to now have my QA manager will decide, do we still pass it along? Another way is starting to look at this and saying, hey, why can't I have the software doing that? And I set the metrics. If you're creating, and the reason I asked, are you creating these test scripts, right? Why not have the actual promotion scripts to say, automatically fail that back, automatically block the build if it doesn't meet these criteria now, and start to look at that. And we can look at some of that as we go along here, but it's really good information that you can decide and send it automatically back. These feedback loops are really important through the whole process. Alerting, routing, alerting, when something fails, are you getting the right alerts to it? And I don't mean the alert a customer calling in. That's a lot. I can't get over the number of times I see this. And maybe this group is really strong about that, but it's all that human interaction that leads to more failures. So you get into that whole idea of, how do I get to eliminate those? Any thoughts, questions, or?
What do you see the teams that don't have
What do you say to teams not letting that?
I'm one of those people that I'm not going to make an assumption right away. I'm going to ask, well, why? Why don't you have that?
Don't have a budget, don't have the interest on the other side.
And how long, and I'd start to look, how long has that project been going on? How long is the success? You know, at the end of the day, you're responsible for pushing these forward. You're kind of that DevOps person. You're trying to make it successful. That's where you've got to build that case to say, you know, hey, we can go without this and I don't have budget, but here's what we're starting to look at and start to create one way or another the metrics. And we'll look at some of the ways you can do that too here. Build the metrics to support it, because you do need to get in there. But the reality is a lot of times, depending on the person that's managing essentially the funding that you're getting, whether it's CEO, project manager, a whole bunch of people, a board of directors, whatever it can be, to say, hey, yeah, we only have this much budget and we have 2 people and that's what you get. So you have to push and say, okay, you need to start to look at, you know, allocating. And it also depends what is the product, the end product, how big is the end user base for it, because it could be something small enough where maybe that is one of those calculated risks, but you got to get into some calculation at some point to weigh it out.
Usually to your point, right, you see companies, and I'm sure you guys even on your teams where certain apps or subsegments of applications, you're doing, you know, not as thorough testing. You know, and a lot of times you have different teams that are actually running different processes or different testing. And it shocks me how you know, one of the things that really has been standard for a lot of companies is standardization of these testing paths and these workflows. There's so much variety to it.
And it's an interesting point you bring up in there, is that sometimes it's the size of the teams, and as the teams, like, so you start and you may not have the budget to do it, and you may have to do with the shoestring budget essentially, right? And make it work the best you can. But what you got to do is you got to cut it off before you start growing. And I meant to ask this earlier, like companies that you guys are all working for, how big are these, right? Are they, like, how many are working for a company that there's, you know, 10 or less people involved in the IT portion of it? Okay, so there's a very, you know, legitimate, you know, you have to work with that, but now I got to start to build for the future. How many are anywhere up to 100? Yeah. How many over 100? So it's got everything in it, and I'm just using, the numbers really don't matter, but the point is that kind of makes sense. As the smaller teams, you have to pay attention to that and start thinking about how you're going to plan that to the future. That's kind of what starts to market you too, and starts to build you as what your value is, and bringing you up as you go in and do this again in the future and expand on your career, essentially, in my opinion. So here's, you know, getting into that reliability roadmap. Again, like I said, automation. It's always where we keep coming right back to that. Avoiding some of that human interaction. And some of this is just obvious. But when you start to step aside and look at it and go, okay, yeah, I knew that, but I wasn't paying attention from that angle. And how you're automating it and what you're using to do it. Oh, what's that? That doesn't matter. But, you know, getting into knowing what your unknowns are. Like, there's a lot of things that you can figure out what's going on that you're not paying attention to because you don't have the right tools to bring it forward to you. Again, going back to that alerting. How do you know that something is running, you do the tests, and you have null pointers going through the application, or you have swallowed or uncaught exceptions in the Java world, or, you know, I'm more familiar with that world than others, but the same in other environments. How do you know you're actually doing that? Identifying these errors sooner. This is a big one, right? We're in right now this whole notion of shifting everything left. Let's find out about these errors well before they get into production. If you look at the cost of an error itself and trying to fix it, as you keep going towards the right, it gets more and more expensive. So if an error gets out there into the wild and is reported back to the customer, okay, and I'll go back to my Hoover scenario, right? When I was working with them, technically It's a company called TTI. They own the branding for Hoover, but we're going to call them Hoover. Customer calls customer service. Customer service starts to note it. Customer service then maybe does a regrouping to the production team or the project manager, or product manager actually. Product manager, nothing to do with IT yet. We're not even in the development cycle. It keeps going down the chain. The cost of that error all the way through, forget the customer exposure, and now what it's done to the value of the branding and the products. It's a lot more, yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So when it's an obvious area, that makes it, it's like, what? How did this even, why did nobody, like, how did we miss that? Again, those are the feedback loops, but the cost of figuring that out, especially the obvious, it's like, oh, let's get a war room going, right? All of a sudden, we're New Year's Eve, or you've got a banking application that's failing, and everybody gets called into the war room. You know, it's a real scenario we've actually been part of and seen happen and helping our customers avoid and get out of. But it's just crazy. So that cost, if I can nip that in the bud right at the point it's at the developer desktop, that's huge. The cost can go from like tens of thousands down to, you know, tens of dollars potentially for the amount of time it's going to catch. So that's where you can, if you can start to automate that, code developers puts in their code, checks it in, boom, fires off a test immediately. You're doing some cases deployments multiple per hour. You got to have these things, and that's why you're automating these tests, obviously, because that really helps. That shift left notion we keep talking about and seeing with the customers, that seems to be, you know, the biggest thing I'm seeing in the industry, and there's these trends that we just constantly see. That's the one I'm seeing a lot of these days. More and better code coverage is another one, right? How do we go in and figure these out? And I'll come back to this one in a minute. Better data, and I talked about this a couple of different ways. Metrics, right? You're trying to figure out how to prove that I need more tests, more money into it, you know. Well, again, go to that end customer reporting the error is a lot more expensive to figure out. The obvious one's fine, but when they're not obvious too, trying to go in, grep those logs. All right, so what sequence did they have? Oh, I'm not going to be able to reproduce it. Let's start to put some code in there to do some logging. Oh, logging's turned off. Got to turn it on too, right? And all the different things you got to go in there. So if you could do all that back down to the left being the developer, all the way to the right and the customer, the end user, a lot better. Looking at the metrics of where these errors are happening. How often is it happening? Somebody mentioned earlier, you know, the magnitude, right? How complex is it to do and fix that? Well, how many people are actually doing that one scenario? If it's only happening once, maybe the prioritization of that would change versus 16 million times. Fun one is thinking about some errors that happen and how much those errors are actually costing you for processing. If you had a metric to tell you that just something that is, you know, being logged out, or something that a null pointer or uncaught exception that's happening in your code, and it happens 32 million times. We've seen customers where it's actually in the billions. It's taking more to process that and handle that error still, which is costing more in the utilization of those servers. So you got to start to look at those types of things and figuring out, and those metrics do matter. That whole notion of a culture of accountability. How many people have like some sort of a metrics hub showing right now of how the development is going by developer? You know, how many errors a developer has? A wall of shame, yeah. Who are your top developers, or even like in things like that? Not a lot, right? And you're not going to say that maybe not in your environments it's not applicable, but we're starting to see that where, you know, the top 10 or the bottom 10 developers and the number of errors that are showing up in the code that they're checking in. In order to get there, you need some sort of a metrics hub to show that, and then you become accountable because you don't want to really be, technically you probably don't want to be on that board on either side of that, because then the expectations are high on you if you're the top 10, usually top 5. And we actually do have customers that do this, that we've seen going through. And then the bottom 10, that's the sucky list for sure. You know, your code's checking in, you're finding out more of your stuff is getting spit out. Again, it's accountability and metrics.
Are there managers and architects in that?
How you would measure that? Yeah, and there's something to that. So we're starting to see this trend. We're starting to see even more so. What happens when you get code from, you've outsourced this, whether it's onshore, offshore, it doesn't really matter, and you start to do the code review and you do your own automated code review, and then you find out all these errors that are actually in the code. We're seeing customers charge back and put in the contracts to charge back to those outsourced vendors because they got lazy. And people are starting to look and make themselves more accountable, or their contracted outfits be accountable to what's going on. By the way, I've learned a funny story. Always keep the drink away from the computer. I did a conference once, 500 people, spilled a Diet Coke over my keyboard. Not a fun thing. Automate anyhow. Static code analysis tools. How many people are using static code analysis tools? 1, 2, 3. You're not, Sean. You've heard a lot. So who's not doing static code analysis? Most of you said yes. I saw a couple. Okay. So a couple of different things. That's what I was going to ask you guys next. What do you consider static code analysis? What are you using? Anyone want to throw out? SonarQube. Pretty popular. Sonar. Which one? Veracode. Yep. Veracode. So, any others? They're great tools, right? They point out something, and their goal is to identify things initially, and even security tools, right? Starting and doing those security scans early in the code. They're good. They're based on the patterns that are in there. Those databases are growing, and it's getting much, like I remember 5 years ago or so, it wasn't as popular because they just didn't have the base. They have them now. Okay, mixture of using JUnit, JMeter, Selenium, Load Runner, like doing a bunch of different tests. The point here is that you're getting these tests to happen off the developer's laptop. They're going into the repositories and doing the scans right from there because developers know how to bypass, and they do. We see it all the time. Like for what we do, and I'm going to keep it really high level as per the rules and appropriateness for the forum here, but we get to go in and see how these different shops are doing it, and we're working with all kinds of different customers around the world. But it's amazing to see how many things could be cut off if you just eliminate some if not most of that human interaction point of it, because they will find a way to get around it. So limit that manual testing to where it's just necessary. Automate the builds and deployments. So how long have you been doing automation of your builds and deployments now? 20 years. Wow, so you've started. That's impressive. Okay. Yeah, the DevOps is definitely, I wouldn't call it trendy, but it's not that it's not either, but it's something that has evolved into a necessary gap to fill in here. And putting these practices all together. So, it's been going on for a while anyhow. It's something you want to really move towards, because I'm finding less come out of those environments. So the reason I was asking this, where I was going to go with that, with the time, maybe somebody else can share another story for this. But you've been doing it for 20 years. Do you remember how and what that did to change your environment and the reliability at that point of automating it?
Sure. So it's entirely.
Yeah. And I would agree. And two or three of the top benefits are probably, well, first of all, you're the mundane, but it's also mundane also costs more. Developers and IT staff are not cheap. So why not have the automated build process, get them back to doing things that I hated doing mundane things. I always sit, and sometimes even to a fault, I'll look at things that I have to repeat twice and try to automate it just because I don't want to have to go through that process and waste the time doing that. But you get past that threshold where it makes even more sense and it becomes extremely economical. Quality. The quality of doing the same thing over and over again when you automate it it's more reliable because you're not accidentally missing a step. You're not changing something. Anything can change. Shit, just the amount of time something can happen to pop up between things happening could actually cause an issue, right? So, those feedback loops. Did anybody else want to share anything else on maybe like anybody else recently started to automate? Okay, that's all right. So, it really is important to have these feedback loops as the code moves through the pipeline, though. And having the automation and the triggers to fire feedback back to you immediately will help you, again, shift left, catch it early, get it resolved, become more reliable on the back end on the right as it gets out to that end consumer, essentially, no matter what it is, whether it's another service, person, anything. Knowing your unknowns. You have the total visibility, the known, right? You know what's in there, you know what to look for. These are your test scripts. These are the things that you're running right now and you're going through to make sure your quality. You're probably all doing that today. You better be. The known unknowns. Known unknowns are things that you can start to look at that what the potential unknown factors are and how you can start to look at them and I'll give you a couple examples in a sec, but you can start to see things that you predict could be going on based on just your knowledge and the history of what can go through there. The unknown unknowns are the hardest ones because how do you know what I don't know? That's let's use a couple of examples here. So know your unknowns. Null pointers. Okay, index out of bounds. Things that are can happen. Those are critical exceptions. For the most part, almost always, you do not want these leaking through to your production code. And I can't get, again, the number of times I've seen and I go and we've talked to, and we have a new customer we're onboarding right now. First thing they told us is, we have really high quality in our applications, no problems at all. And they do everything through feature flags and turn it on or off if they need. So their version of high quality is because they can turn the feature flag off immediately. They put a new feature into production, they can just turn the feature flag off. How many people do feature flags for their deployments? There's a couple in here probably, yeah. Yeah, I had one break yesterday. Oh yeah, there's no problem. It's off. Now you got to go through it, and it's got to kick back and through another deployment cycle, go through all the tests again, and it's kind of expensive to do that, but at least you do have a feature flag. And I'm not saying it's a bad practice, but I'm seeing a lot more of that, and they're calling that quality. Little loose definition in there. But rollbacks, rollbacks happens all the time too, but if you can avoid those, right? But these are the things I don't want certain things to get into production. Slowdowns. Which processes are running slower? Knowing which of those are there to start to look at immediately. Maybe that you can turn a feature off that's going to do that. Errors that are happening more frequently. This is where we get back to that metrics hub, right? Where are these things happening and which ones are adding up more and more? Unhandled and swallowed exceptions. They don't show up in logs anywhere. Why do we have, why are we catching exceptions? Why do we catch them? Anybody's got a developer background? Sorry, to handle them. So if you don't handle them, what happens? I don't know. That's exactly it. I don't know. But the I don't know factor could be actually killing your app. Going back to the customers I see, we go in and we plug in our stuff, and we start to see things that are happening, this perfect code. We have all these uncaught and swallowed exceptions that are constantly being shown in there. And then you start to go, okay, if you had a couple of hundred or some minute number, great. 16.4 million times I remember looking at one dashboard the other day and just seeing this and going, okay, that metric matters. You can't tell me that that's not causing some impact somewhere, right? Why didn't somebody do something about this? That gets back to, hey, you outsourced it, you got somebody else that has to be accountable to it. Maybe you start kicking it back and saying, okay, I'm going to do a chargeback based on this because now I got to fix it. It's costing me X much more to deal with this application. So little known fact, takes 50 to 100 microseconds to generate the exception itself. That's still time. 16.4 million times 100 microseconds. That's wasted. Little things start to add up. Again, back to the shift left. Test early, test often. Have it automated. Go in and create the quality gates to ensure the code quality is there early. Get instant feedback to the developer team right away. Like, if you can go and have early detection of things, again, it's going to cost you a lot less. It's a lot easier before it completely leaves not just the desk, but the mind of the developer. They are already in that mindset of doing what they just were working on. So, you know, it's obvious stuff, but sometimes you just don't think about it. You just get it to a smoother release cycle. So here, the one shameless little plug I'm going to do. I know we're not to go too far into this, but one of the things we talked about, static code analysis, right? Security reviews, looking at what's in there and the unknown. What about running code? While it's running at runtime, looking at the different things that are happening. Swallowed and uncaught exceptions are a great example, right? So this is kind of where we fit in and what we do, and I'm not going to go through a full product plug here, but it's just the idea is that I'm now getting you 100% of all the errors, and you're able to see them, and you start to get into that concept, okay, I can get into a metric hub, right? And sometimes we have like different products. I'm working with Wells Fargo right now. Again, every company I seem to work with, I eventually get back to Wells Fargo. But they're putting together this enterprise software factory, the ESF. And they're going in and they want a portal. And immediately, as soon as releases are going in hourly and being pushed in, not into production, but from the developers, into the different gates and stages of their testing environments, they can go to one dashboard and see a code quality gauge. You know, where are they on that? It's got to be green all the time, right? You don't want to be seeing it go into the yellow or red. You know, where, and that's just telling you how the coding practices are going. What's happening behind the scenes at runtime? These are the known unknowns that are sitting in the background, like we were just talking about. Things that I could be going in and looking at. So there's another gauge for that. Runtime behaviors. And then the security. How is the security scan? Like, how are the different things of the code in real time as you're pushing through, so that now management can make the right decisions as it's going through, or even just, hey, I'm the developer, or I'm a developer group working on this portion, this microservice, or whatever it is. I can start to go in there and see, I better not push this on because I'm going to get shit later on, and this is going to wind up falling on my lap. Yeah.
So do you have any recommendations as to how individuals or team leads can have a constructive conversation with, I'll call them their, whether it's a manager or someone outside the team, like a product manager, to help them understand the importance of what's going on here? And actually, it has to be a two-way communication, right? Because there's all kinds of factors outside of the team as well. But you know, how do you have that conversation? Because I found a lot of teams where they actually struggle is in communicating the importance of that.
Right.
In terms that the business and surrounding peers care about.
And the most definitive answer is it depends. And how do you go and approach that topic? I always go personally back to it's got to financially make the sense and you've got to come down to finding a way to break this down to show how this will affect, improve even just estimate numbers to show how this will help them save money or cost them if they don't do. So looking at it and breaking it down to money, right? That's one way, and the equations to get there, it all depends on what the environment is, right? And there's a couple, I know we have some calculators to show you some of that, and then showing them how exactly what they can build and how they can do it. So I'm seeing this trend right now of these dashboards, like I say in the Wells Fargo one, or any company creating, like using Grafana or using these other dashboard products where you can bring these metrics together and showing examples of what's out there. A bit of the art of the possible at first, because you don't have something you can just show them, hey, here's our stuff before and here's what it is after. You got to give them a bit of the art of the possibility first to say, we got to go and explore this to build those metrics. And, you know, that's not a strong strong answer, but it's got to be built based on what they're doing.
Part of the challenge is the quality on this team is the good enough philosophy, right? So, and it's retention between the product management team can get software features and capabilities out to meet the needs of the customers, but also at the same time, how do you balance and make arguments for quality? It's a very hard change for a lot of companies like yourselves to make initiatives toward quality and take the time to make that push, because maybe it's going to slow you down a little bit and actually start launching these ideas and feedback loops, but it's going to save you time in the long run. But it's really hard to start with proof quality. Because a lot of times what happens is that you're spending all your resources on fixing those fires because of having proof quality, right? It's never ending loop. A lot of times we don't see, unless it's executive sponsorship, and you really have to get the team on board to help them deeply understand that the value will pay off, improving the quality earlier on in the pipeline will pay off. Because they're thinking they're sacrificing features, like they think we just can't focus on quality because we need to keep things up. Well, the problem is that it's a never-ending loop, and unless a company actually focuses on it as an initiative, like sponsorship high up and dynamic, it never happens.
Which is why I bring in the numbers at the end of the day. It's a really difficult answer for all types of environments because it depends on the size, budgets, and stuff like that that's involved. Because some people will say, hey, we need to have like the best of the best APM tools in there for looking at the performance. Others, you know, it's all left in for just the static analysis. And it's a kind of a blend, and it really depends on what the magnitude of that application and the scale of it.
I think, you know, looking at the audience, I mean, you guys, what is the biggest challenge you have for improving quality or getting, you're all probably having these arguments with product management, right? What's the pushback you get?
So what we did was we created squads. So product A has product manager, has the DevOps engineer, has the software developer in it, has the ops operations teams in it, and they meet a couple times a week to discuss what features they're going to roll out, when they're going to have them delivered, and all that, right? And then they are all accountable for setting the roadmap for those things, right? And then the product managers will go back to their teams and provide that feedback to them, and usually that works pretty well, right? But the thing is that you have constant feedback loops from every value stream, right?
Yep.
And each one of those is a value stream, right? So with value streams, you always have that feedback at every stage, right? So we've gotten rid of a lot of noise that way. The biggest struggle is buy-in.
Mm-hmm.
And once you start small, right, with a small team, and then you're almost really over about it. You start, you know, doing the DevOps thing, and then you start rolling it out a little bit more, and people start warming up to it, and then the team start performing, and then pretty soon you start getting, you know, you have the early adopters, and then the late adopters, and then the naysayers, and eventually even the naysayers.
And so I think there's a whole other, I think this is actually an interesting topic that might be even a good one for you guys to go. One thing I would say is kind of leverage the vendors out there, right? Where we can go in and help. You may get qualified out. You may just be able to get some best practices, talk to them, figure out, what they're seeing. And again, it goes back to your specific environment that you're dealing with at that time. Because I think it's so different between customer to customer and size and everything else in there. It is. Yeah, I think it's a good topic.
And I think that another really interesting metric to do your engineering team is just doing an analysis of how much time developers are actually spending fixing code, right? And when it boils down to it, we see the gamut of teams that, highly efficient teams that are doing maybe 10% of their time are actually doing great fixing code. But we have a lot of very mature, well-known, ginormous companies who have developers spending like nearly 40 to 60% of the time fixing code.
Yeah,
Which ends up slowing down the entire.
Well, and what's incorporated in fixing, right? It's identifying where is the problem, what happened in there. It's getting into, we're wrapping up here. It's getting right to where it failed, and then the fixing part is usually the easy, but figuring out what led up to it and looking for that's where we see, and that's kind of where we fit in, figuring out where that problem rooted itself. That's 60%. I was at a large security company, security software company, and they said that 60% of the time is an underestimate to what they're probably spending to figure out how to resolve errors. And that's actually made it very easy to help get them onboarded as a customer, because they've got to go in here and figure out, have better code coverage. And that's where I come right back down to kind of just closing the loop here, literally, on this, is getting in, figuring out how to get to that better code coverage, how to implement the tools to detect where the gaps are today, right? And leveraging the context for tools, the tools that they have like OverOps and others that can go in and get them right down to the problem itself. And the metrics to prioritize those, though, are what drives, just like we started off in talking about, what drives, hey, how do we get into figuring out what we do first? How do we determine what the value of fixing these errors are? Kind of a little bit where you're going when you're trying to get people to realize what to look at. They first have to have some sort of metrics to get there. And that's what it always comes down to. And we look at a metric of, sometimes it's developers saved. If I can go from 60% of your time to resolve errors down to it's only taking you 20% of the time to do it, or even 30, or like anything less than 60 is a savings, which is huge. Right? Getting into health scorecards, weighted average of errors and slowdowns, knowing who your developers are, creating these dashboards to get in and say, hey, how's the quality going? Like between deployments, looking at ratings of your deployments and publicizing them, making this known. You get the metrics, that's great. Metrics are useless if they're not being shared to improve on the quality. Looking at different parts of your application and where it's failing. Even tying together the whole notion of looking at not just the performance, but errors and where they're increasing, when threads are being held or being blocked. And tying that to things like in the hardware, the configuration world of memory, of CPU utilization, trying to tie back code and problems in code back to that's where this stuff really starts to all come together and bring it to a whole. I can send you these as well if you'd like. Actually, they're all going to be recorded, so yeah. So that, and I'm just going to speed through these for the sake of time here. Overall, culture of accountability, making everybody part of it, stopping the, it's them that did it. Definitely not me. That's always the right answer for me. But changing the status quo. Hold everybody accountable and leverage tools to figure out where all yours are and get those early. Shift left, bring you right down to the root cause of the problem and identify and show you how to fix it. The more you can get down to just getting to that, and that's where, at the point we come in, it's actually detecting it at runtime, showing you 100% of where your errors are, and taking where the other tools have left off and having that complete coverage there. So really, here's where we get down to it. Automate as much as you possibly can. Know your unknowns. You know, you do know what a number of them are. You just don't know where they're happening. Identify those errors earlier. Shift left. I keep coming back to that. Capture more context. Figure out how to solve it. Going and grepping through logs. You know, one of our old slogans was always log files suck. In fact, I actually think I have some stickers and stuff. Do we have some back there? Because I have some in my bag. You know, log files do suck to have to go through. You need to bring them out and bring them into a better place, have more code coverage and better metrics. Having a way to look at the metrics and better data is big, and then that accountability. Everybody is accountable to get to moving that forward. So that's where I wanted to go with this. I know I'm maybe 10 minutes over, a little less than that. This is for you, right? Any thoughts, questions, discussion, where we want to go from here? Snacks, giveaways, back to work.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Are some tech stacks better for automated deployments and whatnot than others, like Java versus Python or something?
It's a good question, actually. So are some tech stacks better? Yeah. So tech stacks was the word I was looking for, because I was immediately starting to think about, you know, yes and no, and it also comes down to how you're going to fix it. I find, and one of the bigger things, the reason I like the server side pieces are that there's more to look at, monitor, and figure out what's going on. Right. So if I looked at like a Java or a .NET or something like that, I can run something like us. We run and we actually look at the JVM and everything that's happening inside of it as it's running, or running in the CLR. The other languages like Go, Python, Node, these are all happening more client side, or without a runtime, I should say. They're harder to find to necessarily find all the details. So it depends what they're doing and how much you're trying to get in on them. But that's kind of the first. There's a lot of depth to those that could go in those answers, but it depends. Yeah, if again, creating those thresholds and measurements of what you're looking for and when to fail it, I would fail it and stop it right there. Yeah.
You don't want to be developing code for a month.
There's some, yeah, a lot of applications. There are some applications where if this fails, it has no data but everything else. It's like massive. These are the results of it. It's one of those things where trying to drive, fail to build, or deploy,
That's right, and that's where, so when I get into like talking about the failing automatically and kicking it back, that's where I would want to be able to turn that off. So it's not always advisable to say, hey, always kick it back. Like you were saying, like test early and start identifying it. Make sure that those reports are coming back. Like if I go in and run a quality report right at the time of build, if there's other tests that are going to continue and want to still go and have the fixes still going for those, or testing other things that could be failing, yes, but sometimes it just depends on what that is. You should be able to configure when to actually automatically stop the build process.
Discussion?